There was a time when every serious RC flyer knew exactly what was hanging on the wall behind the hobby shop counter. Gold-faced, precise, heavy in the hand in the way that quality things are heavy, not from excess but from intention, the craft transmitter. You either had one or you wanted one, or you knew somebody who flew with one and watched his plane move through the sky like it was reading his mind. Then one day it wasn't there anymore. No announcement, no farewell, no last run of a special edition to mark the passing of something that had mattered. The shelf where the gold-faced boxes used to sit got filled with something else, Japanese lettering, lower price points, a different kind of future. And the men who had grown up flying craft radios stood in those aisles and felt something they couldn't quite name. Not anger, not even grief. Something quieter than both. What happened to Craft Systems is not a simple story. It is a story about a world champion who built the finest radio control equipment America ever produced, and what a conglomerate, an import wave, and a pivot to computer joysticks did to everything he built. The signal was there, and then it was gone. Philip Craft was not the kind of man who accepted that something worked well enough when he could see exactly how it could work better. That particular quality, call it perfectionism, call it stubbornness, call it the specific impatience of a man who understands a system deeply enough to be offended by its failures, is what built Craft Systems, and it is what made Craft Systems matter. He was born in 1926, grew up in Ojai, California, and fell in love with model aircraft the way boys of that era fell in love with things that moved through the air under their own power. His father bought him his first model kit. He built it, flew it, and immediately wanted to understand why it did what it did. By the time he was designing his own rubber-powered free-flight models, the question that would define his professional life had already taken shape. Why was the equipment so unreliable? Why did the radios fail? Why did a technology with so much promise keep letting the men who depended on it down at the worst possible moments? He served in the U.S. Navy from 1944 to 1946, working on electronics for PBY aircraft, the kind of deep, practical education in how electronic systems behave under real conditions that no classroom could replicate. He came home, earned a business degree from the University of Southern California, and spent the 1950s working as a manufacturer's representative, selling other people's products. Watching other people's decisions shape markets he understood better than the people making the decisions. In 1969, he would describe that period in a single sentence. I was a manufacturer's representative who got fed up with the rat race. The rat race he was fed up with was specific. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, he had been designing RC transmitters on the side. Freelance work, side projects, the kind of tinkering that fills the evenings of men who cannot stop thinking about a problem. His designs were good enough that other companies sold them. Ace Radio Control sold craft-designed reed systems, so did Ektronic. But the products that came back from those arrangements were not the products he had designed. Corners had been cut, tolerances had been relaxed. The quality he had built into his specifications had been negotiated away in the interest of margins that had nothing to do with how the radio performed at 500 feet. He decided to do it himself. In October 1962, Phil Craft started a company in his garage in Pasadena, California. He was 36 years old. He had no factory, no production line, no investor capital. What he had was a precise understanding of what a radio control system needed to do and a refusal to compromise on it. The first Craft products were reed-based systems, the technology of the moment, but built to a standard that distinguished them immediately from what else was available. Word spread the way it spreads in small, passionate communities. One flyer told another, who told a third, who showed up at a club field with a Craft transmitter and let people hold it. He did not build this alone. Virginia Craft, his mother, sold her insurance agency in Pasadena and came on board as the company's comptroller and office manager. That is not a footnote. In the early years of Craft Systems, Virginia Craft was the financial infrastructure of everything her son was building. While Phil focused on design and engineering, she managed the books, the payroll, the vendor relationships, the unglamorous architecture of a functioning business. There is a version of the Craft story that gets told without her. That version is incomplete. By 1964, the garage was no longer sufficient. Craft Systems moved to an industrial plant in South El Monte, California. The company had outgrown its origin in less than 2 years. By 1967, Phil had incorporated Craft Hayes Products, a separate entity manufacturing the servo mechanics, control stick assemblies, and injection-molded plastic components that his radio systems required. He was not just building products. He was building a vertically integrated operation, controlling as much of the production chain as possible because control over the chain was control over the quality of the output. The RC community was small in those years, tight. competitive in the way that communities built around precision skills tend to be competitive, not hostile but demanding. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone flew against everyone. Reputations were made at club fields and at the AMA Nationals, and Phil Craft was building one of the best reputations in the country, not just as a manufacturer, as a pilot. That combination, designer and competitor, engineer and flyer, was unusual. Most manufacturers built equipment. Phil Craft flew his. He knew from the inside what the radio needed to do when a model was inverted at 300 feet in a crosswind, because he had been there himself with his own transmitter in his hands. That knowledge did not stay in the cockpit. It went back to the workbench. By 1967, Craft Systems employed 80 people and was generating $2 million a year in gross revenue. The parking lot that had been empty when the company opened now filled before the morning shift. Men came to work building something they believed in, for a man who could tell you exactly why every component was designed the way it was, because he had designed it himself. For a company that had started in a garage 5 years earlier, it was more than enough. But Phil Craft was not finished. He had a plan, and it required a gold medal. The 1967 Radio Control Pattern World Championships were held in Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. It was September. The Mediterranean light was flat and bright, the kind of light that makes aircraft visible from a long distance, which matters when judges are watching every control surface deflection from the ground. Phil Craft flew a model of his own design, the Quick Fly, on a radio of his own manufacture. He had been thinking about this moment for 2 years, not just the flying. The marketing. He won. Standing on the podium in Corsica with a gold medal around his neck, Phil Craft was not only the best RC pattern pilot in the world, he was the founder and president of the company that had built the radio in his hands. No other manufacturer in the history of the sport had done both, and he had planned from the beginning to turn that gold medal into something larger than a trophy. He flew home to California with a name for a new product line already decided. The Gold Medal series launched in April 1968. The hobby press covered it across 3 publications simultaneously. Model Airplane News, RCM, and American Aircraft Modeler all ran product announcements the same month. The transmitter was 2 inches thick. The servos were smaller than anything currently on the market. A cigarette pack appeared in the review photographs, the standard visual reference of the era, so readers could appreciate exactly how compact the airborne components were. The full 6-channel system sold for $450, the equivalent of roughly $2,800 today. It was not cheap. It was not designed to be cheap. It was designed to be the best radio control system that American engineering could produce, and it was priced accordingly. The market responded with an urgency that surprised even Craft. Orders came in faster than the South El Monte plant could fill them. In 1968, the company employed 80 people and generated $2 million in gross revenue, triple the revenue of the year before. Craft ads began making a claim that was not boastful so much as accurate. Craft Systems was now the world's largest manufacturer of radio control equipment. The most popular, biggest selling RC radio on the planet was built in Southern California by a man who had started in his garage 6 years earlier. The growth was structural, not accidental. Phil Craft had done something that most of his competitors had not. He had built the win at Corsica into his production planning before the competition even took place. He had anticipated that victory would drive demand, and he had positioned the gold medal series to be ready when that demand arrived. The business degree from USC had not been wasted. By 1968, it was clear that the South El Monte facility could not sustain what Craft Systems was becoming. Phil Craft purchased 7 acres in Vista, California, in the northern reaches of San Diego County. A new factory went up, modern, scaled for volume. In early 1969, Craft Systems moved its entire operation to Vista, and Phil Craft moved his family to a house on a hill in nearby Oceanside. Almost all of the employees made the move with him. There was no talent exodus, no disruption to production continuity. The men who had built the company in South El Monte built it again in Vista on a larger floor with better equipment under the same name on the door. What the Vista factory produced in its prime years was not just hardware, it was a standard. Among serious RC flyers in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, flying craft meant something. It meant you were not making compromises. It meant you understood the difference between a servo that responded and a servo that responded precisely. The transmitter felt different in your hands. The gimbals moved with a resistance that had been calibrated, not approximated. Men who flew craft and then flew something else described the transition the way musicians describe the difference between a well-made instrument and a production instrument. You could feel it before you could articulate it. By 1970, the company was reporting $2.5 million in sales. The model plane industry as a whole reported $15 million that year. meaning Craft Systems alone accounted for roughly $1.06 spent on RC equipment across the entire American market. From a single garage in Pasadena, Phil Craft had captured a sixth of an industry in 8 years. The Vista campus expanded. 3 buildings, a manufacturing complex devoted almost exclusively to the design and production of RC equipment and the components that made it work. Doug Sprang, an engineer who had worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and competed at the 1967 Corsica Championships himself, placing third while Phil Craft placed first, came to work at Craft in mid-1970. Phil had recruited him personally. That was the kind of company it was. The founder still knew which engineers were worth calling, still made the calls himself, still understood exactly what talent he needed and why. By 1977, the Vista factory was producing 400 RC transmitter units every week. 150 people worked the floor. The parking lot filled before sunrise. Children of Vista grew up knowing that the building on the edge of town was where the radios came from. The radios that serious flyers used, the radios that won championships, the radios that the hobby press reviewed in language usually reserved for precision instruments, because that is what they were. In 1974, 20th Century Fox commissioned Craft Systems to design the model helicopters and the associated transceiver systems used as practical special effects during the filming of the towering Inferno. The work appeared on screen in front of millions of people who had no idea that the technology controlling those miniature aircraft had been developed in Vista, California, by a company that had started in a Pasadena garage 12 years earlier. Phil Craft knew. His engineers knew. The RC community knew. In 1976, Craft Systems introduced the first synthesized RC system, a transmitter that could change operating frequencies electronically, using a single unit across multiple bands. It was another first. Another technical achievement that competitors would spend years trying to match. In the mid-1970s, on a purely technical basis, there was no stronger argument for American manufacturing excellence in the RC space than the product coming out of the Vista facility. None of the men on that factory floor knew that the company had already changed hands. Not recently, not in a way that had altered the daily rhythm of the work or the quality of what came off the line. But the ownership structure that had made Craft Systems possible had shifted 4 years earlier, in a meeting in Cincinnati that most of the Vista workers had never been told about. The numbers were still good, the products were still winning, the parking lot was still full. But somewhere in the accounting department, a different set of priorities had started asking different questions. In June 1972, the Carlyle Corporation of Cincinnati, Ohio, announced the acquisition of Craft Systems, Inc. The price was not disclosed. The terms were not widely reported. What was reported in the trade press and in the hobby publications that covered the RC industry was that Phil Craft would remain on board as president, that the company would continue to operate as an independently managed subsidiary, that nothing essential would change. That is almost always what is said. Carlyle was not a hobby company. It was not an electronics company in any meaningful sense. It was a diversified industrial conglomerate, the kind of corporate structure that became common in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the prevailing business logic held that a well-managed company could manage anything, that the skills required to run a brake pad manufacturer were essentially transferable to the skills required to run a radio control equipment manufacturer, that the specific knowledge embedded in a company's engineers and designers and production workers was secondary to the financial discipline imposed from above. This logic produced a great many acquisitions during this period. It also produced a great many quiet disasters. Phil Craft stayed. He remained president of Craft Systems under Carlyle's ownership, and by the numbers available, the company continued to grow. By 1977, the Vista factory was producing 400 units a week. By 1981, employment had reached 250 people, the highest headcount in the company's history. Vista's city government would later identify Craft Systems as the third largest employer in the city. From the outside, from the perspective of anyone reading the production figures or walking the factory floor, the acquisition appeared to have changed nothing fundamental. But the men who flew Craft equipment through the mid-1970s and into the late 1970s began to notice something that did not appear in any press release. Collectors who owned both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition units described the difference in terms that were specific and consistent. The gimbals felt different. The tolerances had relaxed, not dramatically, not in a way that made the radio non-functional, not in a way that any single reviewer could point to as a definitive break. But according to hobbyists who flew both generations, there was a before and an after. The before was a radio that felt like it had been built by someone who cared about exactly how it felt in a flyer's hands. The after was a radio that met its specifications. Those are not the same thing. And in a market where reputation is everything, where a pilot recommends his radio to the men he flies with on Saturday mornings at the club field, and those men recommend it to the men they fly with. And the chain of trust runs from the competition podium all the way down to the hobby shop shelf. The difference between a product that exceeds expectations and a product that merely meets them is not a minor distinction. It is the beginning of an erosion. Meanwhile, something else was happening. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, Japanese electronics manufacturers who had spent the 1960s building their precision manufacturing capabilities were turning their attention to the RC market. Futaba had been founded in 1948, originally producing vacuum tubes. By 1962, the company had moved into radio control equipment. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Futaba and companies like JR, Japan Remote Control, were developing proportional systems of their own, systems that matched and in some cases exceeded the technical specifications of American equipment, at price points that American manufacturers could not approach without restructuring their entire cost base. The American hobby shop had always been a place where the equipment on the wall reflected a simple hierarchy: craft at the top, a few competitors below, imported products as an afterthought. By the mid-1970s, that hierarchy was being renegotiated. Japanese systems began appearing on shelves alongside American ones. They were priced lower, they were reliable, they came with documentation translated into competent English and support structures that worked. The flyers who tried them and reported back to their club fields were not disappointed. Phil Craft saw it, his engineers saw it. The Vista factory was still running at capacity, still employing 150 people, still producing 400 units a week. But the competitive landscape that had allowed Kraft to claim a sixth of the American RC market in 1970 was no longer the same landscape. The Japanese manufacturers were not undercutting Kraft on quality, they were matching it. And in a market where matching the quality leader at a lower price is sufficient to take market share, matching is winning. There were responses. The Signature Series, a premium line developed with the engineering expertise of Doug Sprang, represented Kraft at its most technically ambitious in the post-acquisition years. In 1976, the synthesized system offered frequency flexibility that no competitor had matched. These were real achievements, real products, real reasons for serious flyers to stay loyal to the gold-faced transmitters on the hobby shop wall. But loyalty is a resource. It depletes. Every flyer who tried a Futaba system and found it satisfactory was a flyer who had crossed a threshold that, a decade earlier, would have been unthinkable. The threshold had moved. And Kraft Systems, under the management structure of a Cincinnati conglomerate that measured performance in quarterly margins rather than competition podium results, was not moving with it. They called it a period of market adjustment. They were not wrong about the market, they were wrong about the adjustment. The real pressure had not arrived yet, but it was already in the mail. By the early 1980s, the American hobby shop had completed a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had walked into the same store 10 years earlier. The wall behind the counter, the wall that had once been organized around a clear American hierarchy, with Kraft at the top and everything else arranged below it, was Japanese now. Not entirely, not all at once, but decisively. Futaba, JR, Sanwa. The names were unfamiliar to a generation of flyers who had grown up with Kraft and Airtronics and the handful of American brands that had defined the market through the 1960s and 1970s. They were not unfamiliar for long. The Japanese systems arrived with a precision that was difficult to argue with. Servos that were smaller and faster than their American counterparts. Receivers that were more resistant to interference. Price points that made the decision to switch feel rational rather than disloyal. A complete Futaba system cost less than a comparable Kraft setup. It performed as well or better. The hobby shop owner who stocked both and watched customers choose knew which direction the market was moving before the manufacturers did. Kraft Systems was not standing still. The Vista factory was still running. The engineers were still working. But the competitive advantage that Phil Kraft had built through the late 1960s, the advantage of being the best, at a time when being the best was enough to command a premium, had been eroded by a decade of Japanese investment in precision manufacturing that American companies, operating within American cost structures and under the financial expectations of American conglomerates, could not match on price. The pivot, when it came, followed a logic that made sense on paper. Kraft Systems had spent 2 decades building precision input devices, transmitters, servos, control sticks, gimbals engineered to respond to the finest movements of a human hand. A computer joystick was, in its mechanical fundamentals, not entirely different. The skills existed in Vista, the manufacturing infrastructure existed, the brand name carried recognition in the electronics market, and the personal computer industry in the early 1980s was growing at a rate that made the RC hobby market look modest by comparison. Under Carlyle's ownership, Kraft Systems pivoted. The joystick line launched. By 1982, the company had filed a trademark for the micro mouse, a computer mouse product. By 1983, trademark filings covered cursor control devices, computer cable covers, handheld positional transducers. The product catalog that had once been organized entirely around the needs of RC flyers was reorganizing itself around the needs of people sitting in front of Apple II computers and early IBM PCs. People who wanted to play flight simulators and early action games with something more responsive than a keyboard. The irony was not subtle. Craft Systems, the company that had put radio-controlled transmitters in the hands of men who wanted to fly actual model aircraft through actual sky, was now building the devices that would keep the next generation of would-be flyers indoors, in front of screens, flying nothing at all. The RC product line did not disappear immediately. Craft transmitters were still available through the early 1980s. The Signature series still had its advocates. But the factory floor that had once been organized entirely around RC production was being reorganized. The engineering attention that had once gone into refining servo response and gimbal feel was going elsewhere. The men who had built their careers on understanding exactly what a radio control system needed to do at competition altitude were watching their specialty become a secondary concern within a company that was now primarily interested in what happened when a human hand moved a joystick across a computer desk. The personal computer joystick market was real. It was growing. And for a period in the early to mid-1980s, Craft Systems was a genuine presence in it. The company employed 250 people at its 1981 peak, the highest headcount in its history. Vista's city government counted Craft Systems among the 3 largest employers in the city as late as 1983. The Thunderstick, the Triple Track, the Top Track, these were real products, sold in real quantities, through real retail channels. But the computer peripheral market had a different competitive structure than the RC market. In RC, Craft had competed against a handful of specialized manufacturers. American companies that understood the same engineering constraints, Japanese companies that understood them equally well. In computer peripherals, Craft was competing against a vastly larger field. Asian manufacturers operating at cost structures that made Craft's domestic production model difficult to sustain. Mass-market retailers whose shelf allocation decisions were driven by price points that precision American manufacturing could not consistently meet. The late 1980s brought the first visible concession. Some production was outsourced to East Asia. The domestic manufacturing operation that had been the foundation of Craft's identity, the Vista factory, the local hiring from Sierra Vista high school students and disability employment programs, the community infrastructure built around American-made precision electronics, began to contract. Not catastrophically, not in a single announcement, but steadily, in the way that things contract when the economics that supported them have shifted beyond the point where adjustment is sufficient. Phil Craft had retired from active business involvement by this point. The man whose name was on every transmitter, whose championship win at Corsica had named the gold medal series, whose refusal to accept bad equipment had started the entire enterprise in a Pasadena garage. He was in Oceanside, restoring exotic Ferraris, playing jazz piano, living the retirement of a man who had built something significant and handed it to an organization that would take it in a direction he had not designed it for. Whether he watched what happened to his company with grief, or with the philosophical detachment of a man who had already made his peace with the sale, the record does not say. The record is silent on that. What the record shows is that by the early 1990s, Craft Systems had completed a transformation that its founder would not have recognized. The gold-faced transmitters that had defined the company's identity were gone from production. The RC market that Phil Craft had dominated for a decade had been ceded to manufacturers who had been building toward that dominance since the 1960s. The computer peripheral business that had seemed like a rational pivot was being squeezed by the same forces. Cheaper foreign production, commoditizing markets, the relentless compression of margins that follows when a product becomes standardized. The Vista factory that had once employed 250 people and filled its parking lot before sunrise was running at a fraction of its former capacity. The men who had spent their careers building precision electronics on that floor had, through layoffs and attrition and the gradual contraction of what the company needed from them, mostly moved on. Some had found work in the San Diego County electronics industry. Some had not found comparable work at all. By the end of that year, the only question left was when, not if. In 1994, Microspeed Inc., a manufacturer of computer peripherals based in Fremont, California, acquired the intellectual property of Craft Systems, the patents, the trademarks, the design documentation that represented 32 years of engineering work, the accumulated technical knowledge of a company that had once been the largest radio control manufacturer in the world. Microspeed made trackballs and mice. They were interested in the joystick patents, the cursor control intellectual property, the positional transducer designs that Kraft had developed during its pivot years. They were not interested in preserving a brand. They were not interested in what the name Kraft had meant to a generation of RC flyers who had stood at hobby shop counters and reached for the gold-faced box without hesitation. The transaction was clean. The legal transfer of intellectual property is a straightforward process. What it does not transfer is memory. What it does not transfer is the particular weight of a gold medal series transmitter in a pilot's hands on a Saturday morning at a California flying field. The way the gimbals moved. The way the aircraft responded at 500 feet as if the signal traveling between transmitter and receiver was something more than radio waves. That did not transfer to Fremont. That did not transfer anywhere. Kraft Systems went defunct. The Vista factory, 3 buildings on 7 acres that Phil Kraft had purchased in 1968, that had grown into the production complex of the world's largest RC manufacturer, that had been Vista's 3rd largest employer as recently as 1983, went quiet. The machine stopped. The parking lot emptied for the last time. There was no ceremony, no final run of a commemorative transmitter, no gathering of the men who had worked those floors for a decade or 2 decades. The gates closed the way industrial gates close when a company ends, with paperwork and silence, and the particular absence of noise in a building that had once been defined by it. The RC community learned what had happened the way hobby communities learn most things, through the network of club fields and hobby shops and magazine columns and the particular telegraph of men who talked to each other at flying fields on weekend mornings. The gold-faced transmitters that remained in circulation became objects of a different kind of attention. Not collector items yet, not immediately, but something that pilots held on to with a deliberateness that had not been necessary before. Because before, if a Kraft transmitter failed, you could replace it. Now you could not. Now the transmitter in your hands was the last one you would ever have from that company. You took care of it differently. In hobby shops across the country, the wall that had once carried Kraft equipment was fully Japanese by 1994. Futaba, JR, Sanwa, High-Tech, the brands that had been the distant competition when Kraft was at its peak, were now the architecture of the market. They were good products. In many technical respects, they were excellent products, the result of decades of investment in precision manufacturing that had steadily closed and then reversed the gap with American competition. The men who flew them flew well. The aircraft responded. The signals were clean. But the men who had grown up flying Kraft, who had saved for a gold medal series the way a younger generation saves for a first guitar, who had carried their Kraft transmitter to club fields for 15 years and known every characteristic of its response. Those men stood in the hobby shops of 1994 and looked at the wall and felt the specific absence of something that had been present for so long it had seemed permanent. Phil Kraft died on April 9, 2006 in Oceanside, California. He was 79 years old. The cause was Parkinson's disease. He had spent his retirement the way a man who has spent his professional life in disciplined precision sometimes spends his freedom, in the detailed, patient, hands-on restoration of machines that reward exactness. Ferrari automobiles, jazz piano, a life organized around the pleasures of things done correctly. He left no active successors to the company that bore his name. The name itself had passed to Microspeed 12 years before his death, bundled into an IP transaction with a company that made trackballs. Whatever Kraft Systems had been, whatever it had represented in the years when Phil Kraft was winning world championships and designing the radios he flew with his own hands, that was not what the name meant to the computer peripheral industry that held the trademarks in 2006. The AMA, the Academy of Model Aeronautics, noted his passing. The RC community that had grown up flying his equipment noted his passing. Men who had never met Phil Kraft but had held his transmitters and understood from the quality of the construction that someone had cared deeply about what they were doing. They noted his passing in the language that hobby communities use, on forums and in club newsletters and in the conversations that happen at flying fields on quiet weekend mornings. Virginia Kraft, who had sold her insurance agency to become the financial foundation of everything her son had built, was gone by then. The 2 people who had started Kraft Systems in a Pasadena garage in 1962, the engineer and his mother, the designer and his comptroller, were both gone. The company they had built together had been gone for 12 years already. Doug Spreng, the JPL engineer Phil Kraft had recruited personally in 1970, had outlasted the company. The technical excellence he had brought to the Signature series, the engineering work that represented Kraft at its most ambitious in the post-acquisition years, existed now only in the transmitters that collectors kept in display cases and on workshop shelves, powered up occasionally, gimbals moving with a precision that the years had not entirely erased. The Vista factory site did not remain empty for long. Industrial land in San Diego County does not stay idle. Other businesses moved into the buildings, or the buildings were modified, or the buildings were replaced. The 7 acres that Phil Craft had purchased in 1968 to build the world's largest RC manufacturing facility became something else. It became, as industrial sites become when the industry that defined them has moved on, simply a location, an address. A place that meant something once to people who are no longer there to say what it meant. The last Craft transmitter came off the Vista production line years before the company's formal closure. The exact date is not recorded anywhere that the public record reaches. It happened the way last things often happen in factories. Not marked, not announced, not recognized as last until afterward, when the afterward had already arrived and the line had already gone cold and the particular moment of ending had passed without anyone present understanding that it was the moment of ending. The gates did not close with a ceremony. They closed with paperwork and a Thursday and the sound of a parking lot that had stopped filling before sunrise. The Vista flying fields are still there. On weekend mornings, men still show up with transmitters and aircraft and the particular patience that RC flying requires. The patience to build something carefully, to learn its characteristics in the air, to develop a feel for the way it responds that takes months to acquire and is specific to that aircraft and no other. The transmitters in their hands are Japanese, have been for 30 years. The men who fly them are good pilots, the aircraft respond. The sky above the San Diego County flying fields looks the same as it looked when Phil Craft was winning club contests in the 1960s and his company was filling a Vista factory with people who believed they were building the finest RC equipment in the world. The hobby shops that remain, fewer now than in 1977, fewer by a large margin than in 1983, carry what the market provides. The wall behind the counter has been reorganized more than once since the gold-faced Craft transmitters came down. The RC market itself has changed in ways that would have been difficult to predict from the vantage point of the Vista factory floor. Digital systems, 2.4 GH spread spectrum, drone technology that has brought a new generation of flyers to the hobby through a door that looks nothing like the door Phil Craft walked through in 1962. The equipment is sophisticated, some of it is extraordinary, none of it is Craft. The original tooling, the molds and jigs and production equipment that had manufactured the gold medal series, the Series 70, the Signature series, did not survive as a coherent archive. When Microspeed acquired Craft's intellectual property in 1994, the transaction covered patents and trademarks, not manufacturing infrastructure. What happened to the production equipment in the Vista facility belongs to the category of industrial history that does not get recorded. Machinery sold for scrap, or auctioned to other manufacturers, or simply left behind in buildings that changed hands and changed purpose without anyone documenting the transition. The specific tools that built the transmitter that Phil Craft held at Corsica in 1967, if they survived at all, survived anonymously. What did survive is in the hands of collectors. The gold medal series, the Series 70, the Signature series. The Thunderstick joysticks that represented Craft's final attempt to find a market in a world that had moved past them. These objects exist in garages and workshops and display cases in the homes of men who are now in their 60s and 70s. Men who remember what it felt like to save for a Craft transmitter and finally bring one home and understand from the first moment of holding it that the money had been correctly spent. Some of the transmitters still work. The gimbals still move with the resistance that was calibrated, not approximated. The engineering that Phil Craft and his team built into those systems did not degrade with the company's fortunes. The objects outlasted the organization that produced them. Phil Craft is in the RC Hall of Fame. His quick fly design is documented in the AMA archives. His biography, written during his lifetime for the AMA History Project, runs to several pages of dense technical and personal history. The Navy service, the USC degree, the garage startup, the championship in Corsica, the gold medal series, the Vista factory, the years of dominance. It is a record of a man who built something real and built it well, and who handed it to an organization that took it in a direction he had not designed it for, and who retired to a house on a hill in Oceanside and restored Ferraris and played jazz piano and did not, as far as the public record shows, spend his final years in bitterness about what had become of Craft Systems. Maybe that is equanimity. Maybe it is the particular piece of a man who knows that he did the work correctly while he was doing it, and that the doing of it correctly was the point, and that what happened afterward was the afterward. Virginia Craft, who sold her insurance agency to fund the beginning of it all, does not have a Hall of Fame entry. She has the company's early years, and the knowledge that without her, there may have been no Corsica, no gold medal series, no Vista factory, no 250 employees, no third largest employer in the city. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the foundation that everything else was built on. In Oceanside, where Phil Craft spent his retirement, there is no marker, no building with his name on it. No street named for the man who built the world's largest radio control company 8 miles away. He is there in the way that people who build things are there, in the objects they left behind, in the specific gravity of a well-made transmitter in the hands of someone who understands what they are holding. On quiet mornings at the Vista flying fields, when the air is still and the aircraft climb without fighting a crosswind, and the transmitters in the pilot's hands are doing exactly what precision electronics are designed to do, there is nothing to indicate that something important was built and lost in this particular piece of San Diego County. The sky does not commemorate. The ground does not mark the absence. But the men who slow down when they drive past the address on the old industrial street, the ones who know what used to be there, who remember the parking lot full before sunrise, who still have a craft transmitter in a case in the garage that they power up sometimes just to feel the gimbals move. Those men carry the record forward in the only way industrial memory survives when the institution is gone. Not in buildings, not in plaques, in hands that remember what the good version felt like and know that it was real and know that it is over.